There are 214, 215 songs that I've actually recorded. I've written about 500, 600, but I don't know, it's hard to say, you know. The favourite song I ever wrote? Laughing Gnome.
David's last record with the Lower Third, and his first as David Bowie, was Can't Help Thinking About Me. A minor classic of wistful mod pop, its clanging chords and introspective lyrics evoked, not for the last time, the transition between childhood and adulthood. Released on the Pie label, it scraped into the bottom end of the Melody Maker chart, but this wasn't enough to keep the Lower Third together. The next two Pie singles, released either side of the summer of 1966, were credited solely to David Bowie. The first, Do Anything You Say, had a driving, Kinks-ish rhythm, but its one-note melody and unconventional piano riff kept it from troubling the hit parade. I Dig Everything, meanwhile, on the surface a breezy slice of pop jazz, contained lyrics of melancholy isolation, perhaps inspired by Jack Kerouac. Both singles benefit from repeated listening, but Bowie paid the price for refusing to conform to the obvious hit formulas of the day. What Bowie needed was a song so strong that no one could ignore it, no matter how odd it seemed. He must have thought he'd cracked it then with The London Boys. One of Bowie's best songs, it conjured up images of a mod version of Oliver. Bowie's Bromley twang came to the fore as he told of the dark underside of swinging London. Pie, however, refused to release it, possibly because of its drug references and homosexual undertones, or possibly because its musical style owed little to rock and roll, being all orchestrated woodwind and parping tubas behind a show-stopping vocal performance. Bowie returned to Decca, who released The London Boys at the end of 1966. Unfortunately, it was consigned to the B-side of Rubber Band, a cod Edwardian music hall number about waxed moustaches and doomed love, and an even less likely hit. Throughout 1967, the year of the Summer of Love, Bowie followed his own idiosyncratic path. As mod gave way to progressive rock and psychedelia, Bowie released The Laughing Gnome. A novelty record that again linked a mod beat to music hall whimsy, it saw Bowie duetting with a speeded-up, high-pitched version of himself as the eponymous Gnome, while trading some truly terrible puns. It's a song that's haunted Bowie throughout his career, but it's certainly not the worst thing he's done. In fact, it's a charming, catchy number that serves as a useful counterpoint to the pretentiousness he would later occasionally slip into. Bowie's debut album, David Bowie, was released in June 1967. Again, it harked back to music hall and the sound and imagery of children's songs, but the whimsical surface concealed darker, deeper concerns. Throughout, there's an obsession with childhood and fantasy, whether it's the sexual subterfuge of She's Got Medals or the Peter Pan-like charmer of Love You Till Tuesday. Both Uncle Arthur and the Little Bombardier dealt with pathetic outsiders who were unable to cope with adult life. The orchestration came straight from the West End, but there were still traces of modish pop in the driving beat and discreetly throbbing organ. Silly Boy Blue, later covered by Billy Fury, was a Buddhist parable, while the jaunty Join Our Gang mockingly mentioned LSD, joints and existentialism. Bowie was well aware of all the current fads and fashions, but preferred to comment on them from an external vantage point. The children of the Summer of Love, too wrapped up in their own inner journeys, were content to leave him on the outside. It would still be another 2 years before Bowie had a hit.
I'm quite happy in chaos. I feel at home. The idea of living in a fragmented universe is actually quite appealing to me.
In 1967, the family illness finally caught up with David's brother, Terry. Returning in some distress to Kent, he found himself at Chislehurst Caves, where he had a simultaneous vision of heaven and hell. It was the onset of schizophrenia. living rough for 8 days, he was subsequently returned to the family home where David was still living. David's father, now stricken with remorse over his former attitude, agreed to take Terry in, but David himself couldn't cope with seeing his idolised older brother in this state. Almost immediately, he moved in with his then manager, Ken Pitt. Pitt encouraged his charge to look beyond rock and roll. He took David to the theatre, introduced him to writers like Oscar Wilde and André Gide, and together they embraced an altogether more bohemian lifestyle, frequently walking around Pitt's luxurious apartment naked. He was assiduous in his concern for Bowie's career, hoping that he would go into cabaret, but throughout 1968 and 69, David seemed to be firing off wildly in all directions. He left Decca by mutual agreement, and Pitt invested considerable time and money in a doomed short film, Love You Till Tuesday, designed to showcase Bowie's many talents. At the same time, David trained and performed with Lindsay Kemp's mime troupe and supported Tyrannosaurus Rex featuring his friend Mark Bolan on tour as a solo mime artist. He appeared as a dancer in the BBC Two play The Pistol Shot and in a TV ad for Lion's Maid's Love Lolly, the pop ice cream. Simultaneously, he was becoming more and more interested in Buddhism and was seriously considering becoming a monk. Instead, he had a brief but passionate affair with a dancer named Hermione Farthingale, leaving Ken Pitt's place to move in with her. The couple also formed a multimedia folk trio with guitarist John Hutchinson called Feathers. When the affair and the group ended, Bowie moved again, this time to a flat in Beckenham with the journalist Mary Finnegan. They smoked copious quantities of hash and would sit up all night discussing Buddhism and the counterculture ideals of the time. Out of this came the Beckenham Arts Lab, a loose-knit collection of individuals united in a high-minded fusion of the various different creative strands of the late 60s underground. And, during an informal jam session with Feathers guitarist John Hutchinson, was born a song that was to decisively change David's fortunes, Space Oddity. Featuring Bowie's use of the novelty synthesizer toy, the stylophone, Space Oddity was inspired by the film 2001, A Space Odyssey, but its images of an alienated astronaut drifting off into space were a metaphor for another fleeting influence in Bowie's life, heroin. Space Oddity's lift-off sequence perfectly mimicked the ritual of shooting up, followed by the heady rush of the drug entering the body and the resulting sense of dislocation and serenity. Given this ambiguity, it's ironic that Space Oddity was chosen as the BBC's soundtrack to the moon landings. Musically, though, it was a slick, catchy number, reminiscent of the Bee Gees, with a funky break and several complex, overlapping melodies. The publicity it inspired eventually took Bowie into the top 10 for the first time. Space Oddity was released by Mercury Records, largely as a result of the efforts of one Calvin Mark Lee, who also introduced Bowie to Angela Barnett. According to legend, he was sleeping with both Angie and David at the time. Certainly, Bowie was then conducting any number of overlapping affairs with both men and women, experimenting with his sexuality just as he was with drugs and Eastern philosophies. Bowie and Angie quickly became lovers and moved into a dilapidated Gothic mansion on the outskirts of Beckenham, known as Haddon Hall. Everything that was floating around in Bowie's head at the time, including, in August 1969, the death of his father, was reflected on his second LP, released late that year, and also entitled David Bowie. 4 songs on the album referred to David's one true love affair with Hermione Farthingale. Big Ideas, meanwhile, raised their head on Signet Committee and The Wild-Eyed Boy from Free Cloud, both dealing with prophet figures who are betrayed by their followers, anticipating Ziggy Stardust, while drawing on family themes of insanity and abandonment. Both also comment cynically on the hippie dream, but in contrast, Bowie celebrated the counterculture on the album's final track, Memory of a Free Festival. This recounted the Beckenham Free Festival that Bowie and his Arts Lab friends organised in the summer of 1969. Interestingly, Bowie didn't enter so fully into the spirit of things at the time, sneering, capitalists at Angie and the others as they sold psychedelic posters to the smiling crowds. Bowie's follow-up single to Space Oddity was The Prettiest Star, a love song to Angie on which Mark Bolan played guitar. Bowie and Angie were married in March 1970, although neither was under any illusions that they were in love. The night before the wedding, they celebrated with a threesome, and both had practical reasons for the union. Angie, a US citizen, wanted to stay in England, while David equally wanted to wed for the American work permit it would grant him. Bowie, as always, was thinking one step ahead.